Hi, welcome back to an Inspector Calls Act 2 Part 2. We finished with the Inspector Calls revelation or information about Eva Smith being pregnant, which immediately heightens that emotional response from the audience. And you can see that Sheila really picks up on that as well, how horrendous it is. She is the character that really the audience can identify emotionally with, because her response seems accurate to us, that it is awful that this young woman was pregnant and committed suicide. And again, remember, she's set up as a complete opposite to her parents. And look at the difference in response here. Sheila is horrified. Look at the exclamation marks. Mrs Birling, go and look for the father. It's his responsibility. It's so cold, and I'm using that word intentionally because that's what it takes me back to from the stage directions. The inspector, again, is really trying to heighten the emotional, through the language, how horrendous Eva Smith's position was, which is why in purple I've put the list of 3 about Eva Smith, that she was alone, friendless, penniless and desperate. And the inspector, this is his view, that he really believed that what she needed was advice, sympathy and friendliness, and that is what Mrs Birling refused to give, which makes Mrs Birling seem so much more a villain with the inspector's words. And Sheila really heightens that as well when you read that line. I think it was cruel and vile. You know, she really detests what her mother has done there. Mr Birling's response is always interesting. He cares an awful lot more about the public response and how it's going to affect their reputation, shockingly. But interesting, again, we get those 2 different views. So we get a little bit more information about the second story that Eva Smith tells, which is the true story. But before we find that out, Mrs Birling then jumps on the defensive and starts accusing everybody else but herself on who is to blame for Eva Smith's death. So she even blames her own husband. It wasn't I who turned her out of her employment. There's the accusation against, go and blame my husband, go and blame my daughter. And then this purple here is, we find out that Eva Smith knew who the father was. Big hint there, and that should start light bulbs going off with our audience on who that might be. Mrs Birling, again, you can see she's not moving, and she's so prejudiced against the working class that she refuses to change her views. She says that Eva was giving herself ridiculous airs, believing she's got respect and manners. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples. She was almost suggesting that the working class can't have morals and values and ethics. And the irony is Mrs Birling is the one without those, and Eva Smith does have them. And the inspector, again, he gets so angry here. You can see the emotive language. She lies with a burnt out insides on a slab. And his anger in this bold here. Don't stammer and yammer at me. He's had enough now. He's had enough at Mrs Birling's constant refusal to accept responsibility. We also learn here, in another big hint, Mrs Birling tells us that the father was a youngster, silly, wild and drinking. Again, more foreshadowing, really, really obvious at this point. It should be screaming at the audience, but Mrs Birling is completely blind to it. So Mrs Birling's typical prejudice says that Eva would never refuse money of any sort, whether it's stolen or not. But interesting, she does. And that suggests that Eva Smith has morals and values where Mrs Birling does not. And the inspector even highlights that, she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want stolen money. The inspector's almost screaming at her saying, come on, isn't that the right reason to go to you? Because she shouldn't be taking stolen money. Isn't this the right move for this woman? But still, Mrs Birling will not accept that. And look how many times she repeats this. I accept no responsibility. Blame the young man. Blame the father. He'd be entirely responsible. It's almost amusing how much the inspector is setting her up here, even to the fact that Sheila screams at her mum, stop. Sheila knows. And Mrs Birling does not.